Hello, welcome, good evening everyone across Australia. I'm Glenn Isherwood and welcome to tonight's event. Transforming Australia's Agriculture and Regional Communities, a discussion with Australian Citizens Party candidates from across the country. The format of tonight is we're going to get straight into some Q&A following some opening remarks from West Australian Senate candidate Gene Robinson. On the call, on this video tonight, we have the following candidates. Gene Robinson from Western Australia, Craig Isherwood, Senate candidate for Victoria, Anne Lawler, Senate candidate for New South Wales, Jan Picallis, Senate candidate for Queensland, Paul Borthwick, Lower House, House of Reps candidate for the division of Robertson, Lower House candidate Chris Lay for the Victorian electorate of Mallee, and Jeff Davey, the candidate for the Victorian electorate of Nichols. Before we begin, I would also like to say that in 2 weeks from now, at the same time on the Citizens Party YouTube channel, we'll be conducting another live streamed Q&A session like this one. The theme of that one is the fight to clean out financial corruption in Australia. And we'll have more discussion and announcements about that soon. Now, for all of those watching tonight, if you have questions for our candidates, questions for the Citizens Party that you want answered, send them in. The email address for doing so is ask@citizensparty.org.au. And we'll be monitoring and watching that email address all through tonight's proceedings. If your questions come in live, we'll do our best to include them in tonight's discussion, and I will deliver those questions straight to the candidates. Also, for those who would like more information about the Citizens Party, our policies, our ideas, our 15-point fighting platform, please head over to our website and go to the Election 2022 tab in the top. That link is on your screen, but it's citizensparty.org.au. So without further ado, tonight I would like to welcome and introduce West Australian Senator Gene Robinson, who's going to take up this question, transforming Australia's agriculture and regional communities. Thank you, Gene.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gene Robinson, the Senate candidate for the Citizens Party for Western Australia. I'd like to talk about the transforming of Australia's agriculture and regional communities. Now, this is not just a good idea, but it is a life and death situation, actually, not just for Australia, but globally as well. We are now witnessing the onrushing financial disintegration of the globalised central banking system, centred in the City of London and Wall Street, that is driving the world towards war and famine. Unless urgent measures that we are calling for are implemented. The global financial monetary bubble is a hyperinflationary stage of blowing out right now. The best way to grasp this is by looking at LaRouche's graph depicting the collapse function of the world's monetary system and economy. We are reaching the critical point of instability when the speculation is increasing dramatically, forcing monetary expansion at an ever-increasing rate, resulting in the hyperinflation in all markets, especially for primary commodities. This threatens to wipe out the real productive economy, which is the lower line. Sorry, I just lost my place. Causing massive food shortages and a collapse of production and bankruptcy. The increase in interest rates, as financial advisor Graham Summers warns, is a ticking time bomb for the $30 trillion debt bomb that could default, wiping out 50% of the US stock market anytime soon. As LaRouche states, this process started when President Nixon in 1971 floated the US dollar, thus allowing the so-called free market to dictate to governments and end the system of regulation under the 1944 Bretton Woods agreements. Unfortunately, decades of neoliberal free market policies have left Australia very vulnerable in securing the necessities for life. The Australian government is hell-bent on saving the big four banks at any cost to society. At present, we are now witnessing the beginning of a global food crisis and the failure in our transport systems. The crisis for Australia is just beginning, as our dependence on importing all major needs is exposing the failure of not maintaining our industrial capacity, while expecting the so-called free market to fill the void. Our whole transport system depends on imported fuel. We only have 20 days supply on hand, and the cost of that is going through the roof. What little we have of our domestic oil industry left will be closed down within 5 years, the rate we're going. Agriculture production is in immediate danger of collapsing the supply chains of all inputs, causing prices to rise quickly. Fertiliser is the major input for growing crops. The price per tonne has actually tripled in the last 6 months, and this is not going to stop. At this rate, farmers will not be able to afford to plant crops, and the market gardeners certainly will be in the same boat with the increase in labour costs and fertiliser costs and not being able to plant their plants. The manufacturing of fertiliser requires a huge amount of energy, which is directly linked to fuel costs. The war in Ukraine will also cause prices to rise. It produces 12% of the world's wheat supply. Now, Russia has just announced a suspension of fertiliser exports to the West. So that means we'll be in a heap of trouble with no real fertiliser industry at all. I've been involved in farming all my life and recognise the deliberate destruction of food and fodder production in the early 1980s and the family farmer. Country towns are dying, along with all the services. It is the same with manufacturing, science, education, healthcare, and family life. I was very lucky to find the Citizens Party, formerly the CEC, so I could join the fight and become educated in universal history and the science of the visible economy, realising it is the role of the citizen to take responsibility for political change. The removal of tariffs in the name of free trade and competition policy has allowed the dumping of foreign produce in Australia, therefore collapsing prices of all our produce. We need a tariff system, marketing boards, and parity pricings to ensure the production of all commodities, manufacturing and imports and exports, as we did post-World War II. This policy alone will break up the Coles and Woolies gridlock over prices paid to farmers and at the supermarkets. The West Australian Cooperative Bulk Handling Company, a farmer-owned cooperative, is a good example of securing a nation's food supply. It was set up by the farmers after the 1930s depression to ensure grain production and exports to global markets directly from the farmer. This prevented the global grain cartels from manipulating prices, turning farmers into slaves and bankrupting them. The CBH today sells and exports 45% of Australia's grain. It is the only surviving marketing board left in Australia. Dairy, fruit, and vegetable boards, cooperatives have all gone, and they have most of the family farmers, and so has most of the family farmers and their communities, along with education and healthcare, decimating rural Australia. First, we need to implement point 12 on our policy platform, a moratorium on home and farm foreclosures to prevent the mass homelessness and destitution that will be happening. We need to recreate the Australian Primaries Industry Department that used to set tariffs and negotiate government-to-government trade deals for 25-year periods for all commodities. The industry and the manufacturing can thrive, supplying the domestic market and exporting as well. It needs to be the same deal for the Australian Department of Agriculture and the CSIRO, so we can meet the challenges of soil science and production methods without the financial corporate interference as we see the cases today. Develop a fertiliser industry. I know several people who've tried that, to their demise with no government support in sight. Australia has huge oil, gas, coal, uranium and thorium reserves. All that we need to do is develop be developed, creating cheap energy for our industries and our public utilities for providing domestic supplies. Nuclear power is the future for mankind, not the deficient energy flux density, grossly expensive solar, battery, wind power systems funded by the Australian taxpayer, of course. State governments and all federal governments need to implement government guaranteed insurance for all citizens and businesses. We must have public housing for all those in need. There's no excuse to tolerate homelessness. We need to provide new institutions to educate the youth for highly skilled technical development for agriculture and manufacturing, including programs and funding for a new generation of family farmers and manufacturers. Australia has fallen victim to Mother Earth as we privatised and outsourced everything in the name of profit. A terrible record of bushfires, floods and other natural disasters prove. Our government spends $2 billion a day outsourcing government responsibility to profit-first businesses that impose incompetent, unworkable rules and regulations, inhibiting vital services and actually causing negative levels of production, stifling creativity and skills of the individual, incurring unwarranted costs, and in many cases, loss of life and property. Virtually no infrastructure has been built for decades. We need to build the Iron Boomerang Pilbara to Queensland project to develop and industrialise Northern Australia. The high-speed national rail system and 17 major projects, water projects, have to be built, as Professor Lance Endersby designed and fought for all his life to revolutionise productivity and repopulate regional Australia. In our New Citizen newspaper, Volume 5, Number 6, April 2006, titled Australia's Blueprint for Economic Development and the Infrastructure Road to Recovery, Economic Development Corridors. You can get a copy of this online at our website. This educates readers to discover what is possible and how to bring about and build industrial development, creating millions of new jobs and optimism. We need to join the nuclear and space era that mankind has once again embracing for the rightful development of Australia and our future generations. The most fundamental policy required for immediate survival and the future of all Australians is the creation of a national banking institutions to publicly fund essential economic development, industry, agriculture, necessary projects of water and power creation, science, universal education and healthcare, thus guaranteeing our development, economic and social justice, and sovereignty as a nation. I say no to war and green policies devoted to depopulation under the fraud of climate change that Margaret Thatcher launched in 1996, along with her neoliberal policies on the behest of the British Crown. This is a policy of genocide and the biggest fraud perpetrated against mankind. And I say yes to joining China's Belt and Road for peace through economic development. This is a new paradigm for mankind now being built today in 140 nations across the planet. This has to be Australia's future as well. It's your choice. Citizens need to take responsibility now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. And with that introduction, I think the questions flowing in that I see here reflect quite a number of the crises facing rural Australia, regional Australia, especially on the question of the out-of-control inflation, but also the critical factor of the hope, optimism for the solutions, the way to turn it around. So I want to start with a question, and it relates actually to the horrific state of affairs with the floods at the moment. This question comes from Brisbane, and I would welcome the input from all candidates. This question from Brisbane is: droughts, fires, cyclones and now floods. We hear how resilient Australians are. It's character building, that the Mud Army has brought the community together, but call Lifeline for help if you need it. How character building and Australian is it to build infrastructure to prevent or moderate ongoing catastrophic disasters? What's your vision and what would life be like? Go ahead, Jan.
Okay. I think you've got to be bold and go with daring. There's got to be a plan for the whole nation, till rising tide lifts all boats, sort of thing. There's no need to just do one thing or some piecemeal little thing just to help those that are suffering immediately, because the ongoing effects are nationwide. Because you get like flood refugees and things like that, or COVID refugees. So it's not one thing we've got to fix, it's a whole box and dice, and that's what I congratulate Jean for laying out at the start. So a national bank is crucial, because then we don't have to pick and choose. But to prioritise, I think you've got to have that vision and no holds barred. We've got to build the nation like with the spirit of our forefathers who pioneered, the great infrastructure projects like the Snowy Mountain Scheme, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, we used to have our own shipbuilding industry. We could make anything in this country. So you've got to have an intention to solve the problem, the intention to build a future first and foremost, and then those problems of floods and droughts and fires will be mitigated in the process, because it's our children's future and our grandchildren's future that our forefathers thought of, and we've got to go in the fight with that, in the same vein. That's what I'd say.
Yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, look, and thanks for that question. It's a hard question to answer in few words, but looking at what's happened right up and down the eastern seaboard, and it's an event of a magnitude which I don't think that Australians fully understand. We have a fund to fund catastrophes such as this. And I think first and foremostly is we need this government to be removed. Firstly, that's our neoliberalist government is just not able to take care of Australians when we have calamity and natural disasters of this magnitude. We've got a fund, the funds for a response to these sorts of events. Our current government, they're just choosing not to spend the money. I think if I'm not mistaken, I think they've allocated around $1 million per affected LGA, and there's roughly 30 odd LGAs affected. I had this conversation with some people today, and it's rather laughable. It hardly buys a meat pie for everybody. So these funds need to be released immediately. But I think more importantly, as we've just highlighted already, we need a bank or banking system, a national credit bank, to actually allow funds to be secured and distributed rapidly as a response to situations like this, not just have a current government sit on their hands and keep the key and the locked for the chest of money to be distributed, and rely on non-government organisations and charities to fill in the missing pieces. And good Lord, look what we saw. We saw Dutton at the moment. He's starting up a GoFundMe page for people of the Lismore region to have helicopter rescues, and it looks like the people of Lismore are funding their own helicopter rescues. This is outrageous. This has to stop. This type of neoliberalism has to stop. So in terms of mitigating, if we could look at an example of, say, what has happened with the Netherlands, how they look at flood mitigation and how important it is for their nation. Now, if they didn't do that, well, of course, that nation will be underwater And if we compare that to Australia, we have natural disasters that our poets have written about for centuries. We have droughts and flooding rains, and that's the nature of how Australia is. And we have to be very careful not to be sucked into this green ideologies that climate change is going to kill us all and run over the top of us. But if we could enable our a national credit system to fund projects to mitigate flood risk in areas like Lismore, in southeast Queensland, anywhere there are flood-prone areas, and start to spend the money in the areas it needs to be spent. I believe that what's happened in Lismore, we've got governments who just sit on their hands and don't act. There's been reports written over and over and over again. So make no mistake, the Citizens Party would not be asleep at the wheel here like our current state and federal governments are. We will be active into implementing strategies for credit to fund mitigation for disaster relief and avail funds to those people affected from that same process. So that's how I see this. It needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Chris.
No worries.
Would you like to say something, Anne?
Well, the only thing I was just going to add to it is that every problem has a solution. And, you know, one of the biggest problems that we have, we can't change the fact in terms of that was a massive weather event that the area was subjected to. But because of the ideology, as Jean's gone through, Chris has just referenced, this idea that, you know, we as human beings can't change anything, that we literally have to adapt to what's going on. That's one of the problems. I mean, we have the ability to change our circumstances. Every problem has a solution, and we need to look at and find those solutions based on what's the common good principle, what's going to work best to protect those areas. You know, the government has no qualms in sending our young men and women off to fight war, unjust wars, on behalf of monetarist policy. Well, we need to employ those young people in building the infrastructure that will mitigate these areas that can be, you know, inspiring, but also put them in good stead to be, you know, contributing citizens going forward. So that's just what I want to add.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to add too much more to this discussion because it's actually one. I am going to give a plug for our Australian Alert Service. I don't know if people can see that. You can see that now. But we have got articles, and we're covering this issue because it's very topical. And there's an article written in here, Australia's laughable flood protection is a recurring tragedy. Because look, what Chris said was absolutely correct. The point is that if you take a country that is actually, if you take a country that is actually super, I'm apparently got microphone troubles. I'll have to put this thing on. Hang on a sec. And is that better? Technical people? All right, okay.
Much better. That's, yeah, night and day.
Okay, good. Right, okay. You take Chris's example, for example, of the Netherlands, right? Holland. It spends 97% of the money relating to floods on mitigation. If it didn't, then I don't think there'd be enough people in Holland to put their fingers in the dike to stop the flooding from happening, right? But the point is they only spend 3% of their budget on actual recovery. Now, think about that mentality. What if Australia was to have a facility, an institution that was to deal with natural disasters, such that when a natural disaster occurs, people aren't treated as victims because of bad government policy, but they're treated as valuable citizens that need to be supported. This is not a political issue, and the degree that Morrison and these other guys are making this into a political issue at this time is absolutely disgusting. I see there was a news.com article today, you know, political fight develops over delayed aid for flood hit towns. Morrison's over in the West.
There was an announcement made for $1.4 billion aid package. That was great. That includes $10,000 grants for people that can't get back into their homes. You know, thousands of people left homeless. And we've got some of our own members that have lost everything, members up in the New South Wales area. And it's absolutely heart-wrenching to hear what our people are going through. So we have the solutions. Yes, you have a national bank because, and most of the policies you're going to see here tonight exist around this policy of who controls the credit. Is it a private banking system, or is it a Commonwealth-like national bank that we had during the war that protected our country? It's the same thing. It's the same issue. It's all political, right? And you know, Morrison's over in the West. These people can't. The people that are looking to try and get this money can't get answers. You watch. It's going to become a photo op opportunity in about a week's time when he's back from Western Australia. When he's about to announce an election, he'll be up there handing out all this money, taxpayers' money, for the benefit of people absolutely need it. It's a very cynical aspect of Australian politics, and we've got to cut it out. You can read more about it in the Alert Service if you decide to subscribe to it. And I suggest that people stop listening to the major news media and start to read some of our material, because this is a long historical problem. You've had the bushfires, you've constantly getting floods, we're going to constantly get them. That's what I wanted to say, because it does make my blood boil when you see these sorts of reports coming up all the time. The cynicism and the lack of care from a government that's committed to the big four banks, to the private banking system, is beyond disgusting, and it has to change. And we can change it if people get in behind and support us.
Jeff, Davey, I want to hear from you, and then we'll go to our next question. Given this is the first of the night, I think it's a top-down, covers all. So go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, could you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. I want to go back to an interview in 1921 with Sir Denison Miller as the governor of the Commonwealth Bank. Was asked if he, through the Commonwealth Bank, had financed Australia during the First World War for £700 million. He replied, "Such was the case, and I could have financed the country for a further like sum had the war continued." Asked if that amount was available for productive purposes in this time of peace, he answered yes. Sir Denison Miller also said that the Australian press on the 7th of July 1921, "The whole of the resources of Australia at the back of this bank. So strong is the Commonwealth Bank, whatever the Australian people can intelligently conceive in their minds and will loyally support, that can be done. As long as the race that made Australia stands, so too will the Commonwealth Bank." So that's what a national bank can do for you. Thank you.
That is a magnificent quote. And Sir Denison Miller, I mean, talk about someone who was competent in charge of an institution of government in a time of crisis. That's why they had to get rid of him. This next question is from Graham Mewburn, and he prefaces it with 3 points. He says, agriculture and oil are linked in 3 ways. Number 1, agricultural chemicals that are made from oil and gas that enhance food production. Farm machinery is powered by diesel from oil. Food is moved from farm to our local shops in trucks powered by diesel. How would the ACP address the oil food crisis? Jan.
Okay, well, we've got to become self-sufficient. We've got to dump the free trade market economy, the speculative market. We should be producing our own oil and gas, and like we already do, but we're not using it domestically, but we could because we used to, and we should do that again. And only import what we don't produce ourselves or can't. So that's all.
Anne and then Jean.
The first thing we need to do is nationalise our oil, gas and raw materials. And we'd need to set up an Australian National Resources Company and we can produce our own fertilisers by setting up our own fertilising institution. Back in 1985, 96% of all of our crude oil needs were produced domestically. Not now. As Jean went through, we've only got something like 20 days of diesel supplies or oil supplies in the country. Back in 2008, the cost of production of a barrel of oil in Australia was $5, and that equated to about 25 cents a litre equivalent at that time. Now, it would probably be more to produce today, but when you think about it, we're being ripped off by these private oil companies, and the government's allowed this to take place. If we were in charge, we would be scrapping the excise taxes on fuel. You don't fund the roads by taxes that way. We need to have, through a national bank, an infrastructure bank, the roads become a capital investment for the country. They're not funded out of budgetary, operating costs day to day. And yeah, I think that's a good step towards what we need to do.
Thanks, Anne. Jean?
Well, that was excellent, Anne. You're absolutely right about everything. The only other thing I could think of course, is we need to get away from having a trucking industry, which is so huge that it's actually just destroying all the infrastructure anyway. And we're going to have high-speed rail because, we have less railway lines in Australia now than what we did in the 1930s. And that's what we've got to do, because at the moment is so primitive to be still using, I think it's 800 trucks as equivalent to one high-speed train. So, the efficiency would be there to be able to move. And we need new railway lines anyway, because look what happened to Western Australia when we had the railway line taken out by a flood. We basically ran out of food within 10 days, because 80% of all our food comes from the eastern states on the train. So this can easily solve that problem and use public credit, of course, obviously, to build it all and maintain it.
All right. And Craig?
I just wanted to say, I was involved in agriculture for a few years in the 80s before we moved to Melbourne, established the national operation down here. And one of the key things that I was doing, and that was actually using a lot of trace minerals for the purposes of increasing soil fertility. And we were very successful at it in small crops, transforming basically barren soil into very, very fertile soils, but it took a fair bit of trace minerals. As soon as you start talking fertilizers, you're talking effectively having to purchase it from overseas. And I've talked to Jean about this. We actually, and I think Anne might have mentioned, we need a national fertilizer industry. We need our own fertilizer capabilities. There's 74% of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen, right? A large number of fertilizers have a lot of nitrogen. The three main, components of fertilizers: nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus and potassium, NPK. They're the main three majors. Then you've got dolomite and all these other very important fertilizers that are needed to correct imbalances in soils. But to create nitrogen, you've got to find a way of getting that nitrogen out of the air. So therefore it becomes very, very energy intensive, right? So this is why in a country that you want to actually have a developed country, you actually have to have control of your electricity supply as well. That's why we're saying you need to nationalise that too. This experiment in economic rationalism that started 40 years ago to sell off, government-owned power institutions and power generating stations to the private interest for profit has been an absolute disaster for our country. We've lost and we're losing major industries because they can't afford the power anymore. So in terms of the fertilizer industry, to create nitrogen-based fertilizers, you need huge amounts of energy to do that. And the same with agricultural chemicals. Now, we try to get away from chemicals wherever we can, but that's got directly to do with the fertility of the soil. As anyone that's been involved in farming, if you've got stressed plants because they can't get enough nutrition, they get eaten by bugs. Believe it or not, that's the way things were created. And so we use tons and tons of chemicals, unfortunately, to offset the fact that we can't have fertilizer, right? So but we do need to have a agricultural chemical / insecticide industry here as well, because look what's taking place now with the lack of shipping, as Jean was alluding to in her address. We may not be able to get chemicals here if they're being produced in places like China in the first place, because the shipping is so tied up now and the cost of shipping is so huge. The other thing is that a lot of it, we have an enormous amount of oil and gas. But we've got a cartel in this country made up of the oil companies, and they're stopping us from actually finding and developing that resource. One particular report I've read shows that if we were to actually look and harness the potentialities of oil and gas in this country, we'd have between 255 and 512 years of supply. So this idea that we don't have very much in this country that's being propagated, it's just not true. There is a stranglehold globally, and there has been for many, many years, on oil and gas supplies. We ship out most of our gas. We export a lot of our gas. We're the most expensive gas in terms of your cost of living expenses. You know, the utilities are one of the worst. But so we've been privatised, or we ship out gas overseas, and then you have these private energy companies exporting masses of gas, which should be, again, nationalised. We should be getting these at the cheapest possible prices on the planet. So we have the capacity, and again, look, these things aren't, you know, people say, oh, nationalisation, oh, you know, what we're talking about is a political control of the basic necessities for the infrastructure of supporting our population in this country. That's what we're talking about here. Again, same thing as flood mitigation, right? Who do you put first? Private consortiums, private cartels, or the people? So again, we've written a lot about this over the years, but that's where we're coming from.
Thanks, Craig. Now this next question, short question from Ray in Tooradin, Victoria. He says, asks, is there a genuine farmer involved with Citizens Party, or are you wanting the public to swallow more Hawke-style drivel and unaccountable commitments? Go ahead, Chris.
Wow, that's pretty harsh. Yeah, I have a farming background, and I was just I'm really would like to just reiterate what Craig has just mentioned earlier. Yes, I'm from a dairying background in the Riverina. I live in North Victoria at the moment, but just one more thing I could maybe add to what Craig said is the key to our successful farming practices is moving away from conventionally driven systems to biologically driven and regenerative farming. I've lived experience. We did this on our dairy farm, and we were very productive. The only element that was an issue for us was, of course, water and water availability, and that's another issue again. But certainly, to answer this person's question, yes, I am a farmer.
Jeff? Go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. My grandfather was a farmer. My father was a farmer. I was a dairy farmer. And I have a son now who's a dairy farmer too. So I come from a long background, mate, of farmers. So you don't have to worry.
I'll have a lie down now.
I've got to jump in here because, Jean goes back to the Citizens Electoral Council of 1997. Might have been 1993, I can't remember quite, Jean. But look, we built our organisation on the back of most of the rural population in this country. We had next to no exposure in the cities. In 92, I came down and established a national office here in Melbourne, and we began to involve and develop more urban-based operations. Anne's in Maitland running, trucks that deal with agriculture all the time. Jean, Wayne, Jean was telling us just the insurance bill, telling the office just the insurance bill that poor Wayne, the husband farmer, had to write out for their property was $100,000, right? I mean, these are the sorts of problems that we've been dealing with as a party for years. And my own background is quite simple. Nolene, my wife, and many of you might have talked to watching this program tonight, her family's based in Kingaroy. I ran a business in Kingaroy for 5 years before we started the Citizens Party, the CEC back then. I've had constant engagement with people in that rural sector. I was on the farm myself, growing small crops, as I mentioned before, for 3 years, right through some periods through the 80s and then through the 90s. So I've had an interaction with farmers that I really do appreciate the nature of how difficult it is to run a commercial operation when you're not just dealing with markets, free trade, all the economic rationalism crap, you also got to deal with the weather as well, right? It's a tough gig, right? And then you want to talk about the fertilizers and all of that stuff that we just talked about. I can tell you, Ray, we have absolute empathy but also a deep knowledge of what genuine farmers actually have to put up with. A long experience with it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, this question has come in since Jean gave her opening remarks. It's a very serious one. It relates to the final statement in Jean's remarks at the beginning. It comes from Anthony, and it is, if we have the resources we need to build Australian sovereignty, why then would you be in China's debt in joining the Belt and Road as they are blackmailing other countries into? Okay, well, maybe I'll go to Jean to answer that first, since it's directed from her opening statement, and then Anne following Jean. Go ahead, Jean.
Hello, Ray.
Yep.
Yes, unfortunately, you're reflecting the very much of the popular line that the media portrays, but what's actually happened in the world, and actually I was born in Africa, and we're about 8 generations of farmers from all over the world. And what you've had happen is this 2013, there was a recognition by some of the biggest nations on the planet that the present neoliberal system was finished, absolutely bankrupted the world. And they've decided that they're not going to put up with a neoliberal and this, establishment of an oligarchical system, which is dictating, how the world's going to live. So they created a conference called the BRICS conference, which is Brazil, India, Russia, and China, and South Africa. And they created a brand new system for the world to join. And what the most important aspect of that system is they actually created 3 brand new big public banking institutions to actually fund the infrastructure development. So this is not private banking. This is not China's banks. This is the public credit system. Because how do you think China has become almost the biggest economy in the world in 3 decades and taken 850 million people out of poverty? And it's not by private banking, it's by public credit system, which of course is the American system of economics, which Australia adopted in 1911 when we created our Commonwealth public banking system, which built this country. So what you see today is all these, particularly in Africa, where you've had 300 years of absolute tragedy and poverty and no right to develop whatsoever. You have 600,000 children die every year under the age of 5 from malaria, nevertheless, everything else on top of that. And now we see the transformation of all those nations because they have the helping hand of another nation where public credit is funding the development of those countries. High-speed rail, they've just all signed up to nuclear power. There's nuclear reactors being built. So what you've got is this revolution of this idea of a public credit system, which is what the common good and general welfare in a true constitutional republic is actually about, which actually defends and puts people and development first. So, I'm disappointed as usual to hear the usual rhetoric, anti-China, anti-Russia, whatever it is, but nobody points out to who the real enemy in the world is. And it's, these huge, great big corporations like Craig gave the example, oil company. Who owns the four biggest oil companies in the world? The British monarchy does. Who do you think's been raping and pillaging Africa for the last 200 years? And my family was forced to leave Africa because the British government threw my parents off their farm. No choice. All right, thrown out of the country even though you're born there. Just as well it didn't happen today, we'd probably spend the rest of our lives in a detention centre, wouldn't we? So people have to understand what the nature of is what's happening on this planet, and this great phenomena which is now happening, which is going to save mankind if we don't blow it up with nuclear war first. But Australia has to have a careful look at what it's actually doing, because it's actually promoting war and genocide, and we have to change that. That's not the nature of Australia or Australians. You know, that's why we came to the lucky country. Thank you.
Anne, would you like to comment to that question as well?
Well, I think Jean covered it pretty well. I don't think there's too much more that I can add to it, other than if you think about what the old Labor Party policies were, which I think Jean touched on, they were modelled on the principles of the American system of political economy based on national banking, as is what China is doing today. It's a bit of an irony when you think about it that China's a threat to America using the system that made America strong, but now because America, you know, gave up that system, they're a basket case, and so they want to go, you know, try and create war. Well, we want to align with peace and development, which is why we support the idea of joining BRICS and building infrastructure.
Thanks, Anne. If I could just add one point there, I think in summarising both responses and what Jeff quoted from Sir Denison Miller earlier, in joining the One Belt, One Road initiative of China does not involve having to borrow any foreign money at all. The mechanism, as Jean mentioned, is through public credit, and that used to be the case in Australia with the Commonwealth Bank, which was privatised. So under our policies and our fighting platform, we would remove the reliance on foreign money, but that does not mean we lose the collaboration around mutually beneficial economic trade and progress, which One Belt, One Road exemplifies, with over 150 countries participating, which is a huge number of countries. I've got Paul Borthwick. Go ahead.
I've only got one quick statement regarding that question about being in debt to the Chinese. I lived in Thailand for 3 years in the mid to late 90s. And apparently there's a bit of an economic problem there, and I don't know the exact facts, but what I believe happened was they went to search to get foreign credit to support their economy. Now, apparently they had arranged a deal with the Japanese, and apparently the IMF stepped in and said, no, you can't do it from them. It was all arranged. You've got to basically sell some of the assets to foreign companies, the US companies, and then we'll give you the credit. And that's all I'll say about it. So to say that the Chinese are going to put us in debt, we're already in debt, and the IMF and the World Bank and all those, which are predominantly American, do actually have horrible restrictions on potentially developing countries. So that's all I've got to say about it.
Thanks, Paul. Jeff, and then we'll go to the next question.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. This is banks' poverty policies from the age 25th of the 11th, 91. The world is doing something, isn't it, about the billions of dollars, 13 million children a year die of hunger and diseases of poverty. To stand by and do nothing when the world has the resources to feed them could be a crime as great as genocide, Mrs. Justice Elizabeth Evatt told the recent Freedom from Hunger campaign conference. The world is doing something, isn't it? What about the billions of dollars of aid the West has poured into third world countries over the years? Last year alone, the developed world gave developing countries $50 billion in aid, and it took back $93 billion in debt repayments and unequal trade deals. While rich countries plead compassion fatigue, last year the world's poor gave $43 billion to the world's rich. And you had idiots asking questions about being in debt to China.
Okay, this next question is from this next question is from Central New South Wales. Water security for regional towns during drought. Could the sewage works of large regional towns be upgraded so the wastewater can be processed to be reused by the town for livestock, crops and even drinking if the process is done correctly? When there is no drought, the water could be stored underground for future use. And then there's a second question from the same. The method of shipping produce to and from regional areas. Most transport is currently done by road, but we should look at upgrading rail services to regional areas for increased use of rail freight on a regular basis. Produce could be shipped by road from small regional towns to nearby larger towns to then be sent by rail to the major ports and capital cities. So it's more a statement than a question, but I would welcome input on this basis. And it also touches on the question of over-reliance on centralised supply chains. Anyway, Chris.
Well, thanks for the question. There's a lot in that, but I'll just try and keep it as brief as possible. Issues of water, I'm not sure where this particular question is coming from or what part of Australia, but I know in parts of Australia where we have our irrigation water, well, part of taking care of our problem of water availability would clearly be to embark upon major infrastructural projects like building dams and water facilities and things like that. And I'm not going to list them all. They're on our website. This is a way to solve our water issues for inland Australia. Yes, certainly you could treat water and store it and all those sorts of things, but I think that seems to me to be a bit of a band-aid solution for a problem that's far bigger than just treating or recapturing or recycling water. Onto issues of moving produce in and around the nation and from farming from paddock to plate. Well, clearly, as we've discussed with some of the other questions, we're suffering a problem from decaying infrastructure like railway lines, and we needed to have desperate investment in upgrading and replacing our railway networks so we can get our trucks off the road and we can get our produce to market to where it's got to go efficiently on a rail network. Issues of we could also address with water and power would be the use of nuclear technology and nuclear power stations to use recycled water or water that is surplus, be it wastewater, to be desalinized, purified, and use that in a cooling process for our nuclear power station, which could be strategically placed around parts of productive inland Australia and agricultural hubs. So there are some of the solutions for that. There's never a problem that can't be solved through the Citizens Party.
And to Jan in Queensland.
Yeah, I wanted to say, well, I agree with all those solutions Chris put forward, but to address the recycled water, it's actually recycled sewage and it's not palatable. Anna Bligh, in Queensland, when she was Premier, we had a drought, there was fears, what are we going to do? So instead of doing what we should have done decades ago and build the dams, they went through the recycled sewage process. And my husband directly did that because he's a lab technician. They were going out to Bundamba and testing the process of make sure it's drinkable. It's cleaner than clean, which it was. However, it doesn't solve the problem because when the next drought comes, you still have that problem, because what happened with that water that they made cleaner than clean, it didn't get used because it did rain. So then there was a thought, well, do we put it in the dams? What do we do with this recycled sewage, which had people weren't happy about drinking that, so they didn't want any more bad press about it. But the intention was to put it back in the dam, like put that clean water, formerly sewage, back in the water holding places. But they didn't want to do it because the dam was so low, so they intended to do it when it was full, but that defeats the purpose. So they used it for industrial purposes, which is good. They didn't waste it, but where does water go anyway? It eventually goes into the lowest point. So it never actually goes away, but the problem stays if you don't build the infrastructure. So we have to do that.
Thanks, Jan. This next question comes from Pinky, and it is, what are the Citizens Party's projects to uplift Indigenous Australians out of poverty? As an Indigenous Australian who supports your party, I hope you read this question. Jan?
I'm happy to answer it. But, well, there's one race, human race. We're all equal, and we treat, people as equals. So I believe that the Indigenous are an enforced, their enforced backwardness is being imposed on them, just like economic policies are ruining our lives, but more so their lives, because no development is taking place, even less development is taking place in those mission areas where some Aboriginals live. So if we developed Australia with the infrastructure bank, the National Bank, everyone benefits, doesn't matter what colour or race or religion or where you live. We've got to do it in the national interest. One of the projects I really like is the Australian Ring Rail, which goes through the agriculture and mining areas of Australia away from the coast. And this idea was pioneered by Professor Lance Endersby. So it has feeder arms that go out to the major cities and ports. But it's not just high speed, it's not just rail. It would have its infrastructure corridors that would include, roads and water infrastructure, gas pipelines, fiber optics, creating full-time, meaningful, well-paid, skilled work for anyone who wants it. So, it's nice to have this romantic vision of the outback and our Aborigines, but I think they shouldn't be forced to be in a backward state, and neither should the rest of the country. Because human beings are creative, right? We have this, what makes us human is the ability to solve problems, to come up with solutions to problems. And if we're not allowed to do that, if everything's got to stay the same, if we're only allowed to, for instance, if we're only allowed to do the weaving or do the dot paintings, but we're not recognized if we want to be a classical composer or violinist or something, then, they've got this stereotype, this is how we should be kept. When I say they, I think it's imposed on other Australians that some should be kept in this box. Anyway, I think there's a big racist policy governing Australia. Yeah, I might have put my foot in it, but that's how I think.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Jen. We'll go to Chris.
If I could just add to what Jan was saying, but just also highlighting that there is gross inefficiencies in our country's ability to deal with Indigenous health issues. and that's symptomatic of what's happened to our healthcare system here in Australia. So once again, if we could just draw from the previous questions and some of the solutions to addressing those issues that inflict our Indigenous communities and First Nations communities with their health, for example, with health issues. And this could be all funded through a national credit bank to get all Australians, be it whether our First Nations peoples, our migrants, our settled Australians, we all need the same healthcare, but certainly the inadequacies in Indigenous healthcare should be considered, or is a national emergency, and this needs to be equalised with funding spent in the right areas for their health, and that can only come from a national credit bank. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Chris. Craig.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on this one because it's a very, very important issue, because Indigenous people are invariably sidelined, and you get a lot of hand waving from governments doing this and that and the other thing, but it comes down to a lot of the local communities have to be listened to about what they actually need, and then you can deal with the problem. But you have to have a commitment to do that first and foremost, and not just a hand waving exercise, but it has to be part of a bigger process. And what Jan was mentioning about the Australian ring rail proposal is absolutely vital. I mean, a lot of Aborigines live in regional towns, right? Large regional towns, some of those. So you have to think about, how do we build infrastructure that services not just for the Aboriginal population, the Indigenous population, but for all Australians. And that's where Lance Endersby's proposal of a high-speed ring rail around Australia, or initially his proposal was from Melbourne up through the agricultural areas in New South Wales and Victoria, up through inland, up through to the Northern Territory, so that we could have a point of export for all the crops and everything that's governed by that. Now, this wouldn't be just what we've got being developed now of a high-speed freight corridor, freight train. This would be the state-of-the-art technologies of high-speed magnetic levitation trains. So if you took a town like Dubbo, for example, which takes at least 8 hours to get to from Melbourne, you could hop on a magnetic levitation train and be in Melbourne, right, within 2.5 to 3 hours. That's the sort of speed they're talking about. Right, so what does that do? It opens up Australia. It allows people to move around more. At the same time, that means that you can have much better infrastructure. You have to have a lot better infrastructure so that you encourage people to come back and live in the regional areas. That means better healthcare, right? You also have to, in the case of, and this is a big one for Aborigines because of the centralisation of healthcare in our country, and the shutting down in many cases of hospitals in small towns.
Yes.
Right. All people get marginalised by this policy. Now, this is where infrastructure runs like the veins and arteries through our body. It provides the essential corridors for real economic development. It makes things possible which haven't been possible in the past. It means that you can shift goods, high quality goods like Lance Endersby was proposing in his magnetic levitation high-speed train system, in very quick time around the country. You open up new markets, therefore you're creating new wealth. And people say, well, how much is it going to cost? Where the money going to come from, right? Like with healthcare, everything, right? This is basic economic infrastructure and you have to fund it. There should be no profit motive in building and supplying infrastructure from a monetarized point of view. Profit has to be seen as the increase in physical economic output, what we actually produce. That's what real profit is. How much are our farmers producing? How much is our manufacturing sector producing? Right? How long does it take you to get healthcare? How many doctors are there in rural areas? Right? And this is, I hear it time and time again, there's all these incentives to send doctors out to rural areas, right? Because it's difficult to live out there. But with a high-speed rail system, connectivity, spur railway networks and so forth, you change the nature of the country. And that means you build such things and you have a top-down approach. I mean, we've got no high-speed rail in this country, None at all.
No.
China's got 20,000, going to build 30,000 high-speed some of magnetic levitation stuff in the space of the next 8 years. 30,000 kilometers, we've got nothing, because they have an intention to build and transform not just their landscape. They're lifting people out of poverty. 800 million Chinese have been brought out of poverty because of a specific government policy. So, and we fund that through a national bank. We don't have to give away our sovereignty. In fact, China would demand that we be sovereign, just like them. So that's the way you bring all Australians, and particularly Indigenous Australians. We have to have like a wartime mobilisation for Aboriginal health, which means, thinking about how do we get more healthcare into regional areas where there are major problems with health. How do you bring industry into remote areas in order to be able to provide meaningful jobs and for something for all people to do? So that's the way that we look at it. But it starts, you have to have infrastructure first. You have to build the corridors of development in order to be able to open this very, very, very vast country up and transform it for all Australians.
Thank you, Craig. That leads me to a question to stay within Northern Australia. These questions do come from Darwin. There's 3 of them, so bear with me, but they allude to exactly this point of development. So they go as follows. Number 1, the Northern Territory needs to solve serious water problems. There is a plan to dam the headwaters of the Victoria River to increase storage. There is talk of reactivating Manton Dam, which was a hydropower facility decades ago, and proposals to raise the height of the Darwin River Dam retaining wall. Number 2, the Northern Territory has many industries that could be value added through manufacturing: horticulture, beef processing, mining of manganese and lithium. We could restore the aluminium plant at Nullumbi and expand advanced hydroponic food production to counter the pest and bug warfare in the tropics. And 3, we need flood mitigation along the Adelaide to Darwin rail road link and new high-speed rail with Darwin as the gateway to Southeast Asia via fast shipping. And we need modular nuclear power plants to replace our ageing gas fuel generators. Would the Australian Citizens Party prioritise these projects, and if so, how would they be funded? So there's a lot in that, but I think it's quite ironic that, Citizens Party headquartered in Melbourne loves talking about Northern Australian infrastructure. So, yeah, I like the sound of all of those ideas. Go ahead, Chris, and Anne after Chris.
All I can say is yes, 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 National Credit Bank.
All right, Anne?
Well, I think that any of the development would have to be prioritised on what would be nationally significant. If they're significant for the state, like the Northern Territory itself, you would look at state banks, because public banking is not only something that can be done at a federal level, it can be done at a state level. In terms of building infrastructure, we've got the, as part of our national banking system, is the Infrastructure Development Bank. So therefore, you've got low interest, long-term credit that can be made available for local, state and federal governments to fund and build infrastructure. The policy of the Citizens Party is that we don't have to rely on, or not only we do not have to, but we wouldn't rely on any foreign investment. We don't believe in asset recycling, selling something that you've got to be able to fund building something else. And we don't believe in public-private partnerships. With a national infrastructure bank, we can fund that development, as I say, with low interest, long-term credit. And you pay for it because of the increased benefit to the actual state or to the country because that infrastructure is in place.
I was going to mention that earlier about the importance of staying clear of public-private partnerships and back-end or under-the-table deals between governments and private corporations to run infrastructure. Absolutely not. In fact, I might bring this question in now, and then I want to talk about the labour force. I've got a few questions on that. But this comes from Peter in North Melbourne. He asks, does the Citizens Party intend to publish its governance policy and procedures against which it intends to operate? Further, what governance arrangements does the Citizens Party intend to apply to those institutions it intends to create via industry nationalisation? In short, nice ideas, but the devil's always in the details.
Can I
Craig,
answer that one?
go ahead.
Yeah, the devil is in the details, and it starts with the National Bank, right? First and foremost. If we don't have a national bank, none of this is possible. And as far as the governance of the National Bank is concerned, we've had a magnificent institution called the Commonwealth Bank for many, many years that actually supported us and developed our economy for 50, 60, 70 years. And we would bring back that same sort of governance. I'd love to see Bob Katter as the head of the Commonwealth Bank, someone who has a deep understanding of what banking issues are and fights for the general welfare and common good of the population. So you can't start to begin to nationalise things unless you've got a ball walk that you can stand behind and say, okay, you don't want to play ball, then we're going to nationalise you. They will pay you out. We'll buy your shareholding out. This is what Shifty tried to do with the banks in the late 50s. Sorry, the late 40s. Yeah, late 40s. He was going to nationalise the banks to bring in a full public banking system owned by the Commonwealth Bank, and he was going to pay the shareholding out at a limited amount of the other private banks and take them all over, right? You've got to think about, we're thinking about this in terms of nationalising industries like gas, nationalising industries like petroleum and so forth. Those resources belong to the Australian people. They don't belong to private consortiums owned overseas. They don't. They belong to us, the Australian people. Therefore, when you're nationalising things, you have to have that idea first and foremost, and you have to find the people in this country that are prepared to stand up and say, okay, well, we'll be fair as we can, but they actually belong to the people of Australia, not to some sort of global market. So this sense of putting the policy of governance for us is putting the general welfare and the common good ahead of every other private, Mont Pelerin driven / economic rationalism, neoconservative, neoliberal agenda, which makes us very, very different than any other political force in this country. And that's what people are going to be crying out for. You take, for example, the petrol prices, right? We're being told by Scott Morrison, oh, this is because of the war in Ukraine. Crap. It's because Joe Biden decided to put sanctions on Russia, right? That's what's forced the price of petrol up, because it's meant that all sorts of infrastructure has been impacted. The price of oil's gone through the roof. That's where that's coming from. And, these are the sorts of lies that you get fed by politicians that are committed to maintaining the status quo. They've got to lie, they've got to twist the truth, they've got to tell you what's not true in order to protect the positions. So in terms of governments, it's a common good and it's general welfare. Specifically, you create institutions that whether they be marketing boards like Jean was talking about before, that have the interests of the producer at hand, or institutions that fundamentally have the interests of the consumer, i.e. the people at hand in terms of electricity and so forth, and you go from there. So we've been very clear over the many, many years that we've been in politics that this is our approach. But it does start, as I said, you've got to take on the big one. You've got to have a public bank, a publicly owned bank, and elaborated, development banks, National Development Bank, state banking falls into this. It's in the Constitution. You can have, all of these different interest, all this, and a national bank to oversee the whole thing. Now, we're in the legislation for that. So that's what's got to happen first. If we don't get that, you've got no way of controlling anything from the point of view of putting people first, because the banks are going to continue to loot the population.
Thanks, Craig. I also want to mention that to look at the legislation we've drawn up for the Commonwealth Bank and other measures We have draft legislation on our website. Head to our policy page, banking and finance, and you'll see that in many cases we've built into our legislation and proposed legislation safeguards and mechanisms to ensure that they don't lose their way. The intent is clear in the design of these institutions. So I also want to mention now that we will be taking some more questions for the next 15-20 minutes, but then if we don't get to your question, we will take it up at a future time, or we'll have an email response for you. So keep the questions coming in at ask@citizensparty.org.au. That's up on the screen now. So this next question does come from someone, I presume that's rural, from Terry. He asks, what is the Citizens Party's policy on firearms use and ownership in Australia? So maybe some quick answers for this one from our candidates broadly. I figure a few of you will have quick answers for that. Jean or Craig? Jeff? Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I'm actually a shooter myself. I have about 7 registered guns, and I went out to the creek last night actually, but I didn't bother getting up too early, and I didn't get the gun out. I just enjoyed camping with friends. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Craig?
This has come in from Terry. I know that Terry asked this question, I think, the last 2 events, and it's good that he asked it again. Look, the issue with guns is not the legal abiding citizens that want to get a firearm. It's the illegal firearms issue. And that's where the emphasis has to be placed, on the illegal firearms. If people need to have a gun or would like to have a gun for a lawful purpose, then the law already exists for that to happen, right? The problem is, as we saw with John Howard, this idea that somehow you have to be afraid of guns. No, you have to be afraid of criminals with guns. And there's plenty of laws that deal with this. So our as with everything, we don't want to persecute citizens for owning guns. There's plenty of legitimate reasons for it, and the laws, there's plenty of laws that cover both the legal ownership of guns and the illegal use of them. But in general, this is one of these specific areas that I would defer to the Australian Shooters and Fishers Party. Oh, there's another political party. Yes, we do collaborate with other parties, right? I'd ask them what they thought about specific issues when it came up with gun control, or the Sporters Shooters Association, which is a lawful umbrella organisation for everyone who has a firearm and wants to use it. But in a sense, you don't have to demonise lawful Australians for the ownership of guns. If they need one or would like one for participating in a shooting club or something like that, then that should be everyone's right. And that's our position.
I would actually also say that it's similar in many ways to the fight we waged over the cash restrictions bill, or the $10,000 cash ban bill, that they tried to justify by saying this will shut down the illegal criminal syndicates and tax dodgers and others who use cash for unlawful purposes. And it was quickly pointed out that we have all the laws in place to do that already. So what really is the agenda? And it's clearly to benefit the banks. So we're, just an observation of a similar parallel, that we will not, we'll look at everything on its merit, but then don't dress things up for when the agenda is something different. So these next 2 questions, actually one comes from northwestern New South Wales from Bruce. The other one comes from central Victoria. They both pertain to the question of labour. So Bruce in northwestern New South Wales says, I am a farmer in regional New South Wales, and every year we rely on contract labour to help harvest and transport our crops. Once upon a time, we could be guaranteed of seasonal overseas workers and teams from other states to fill this need, but we clearly need more highly qualified local operators. How would the ACP address this rural labour crisis? And from Central Victoria, during the last 2 years, we've heard many horror stories about farmers losing crops because they couldn't be harvested. The workforce was not there to do it. What initiatives or schemes would the Citizens Party support to address the critical labour shortages facing regional Australia? What does the Citizens Party think about the present system that relies on an itinerant foreign workforce, be they backpackers or Pacific Islanders, work holiday visas? What can be done to be less vulnerable to this disruption to the foreign workforce, and how would the Australian Citizens Party get more Australians to work regionally, especially young people? There's a bit in that, but it's all under the same theme. Oh, yeah, Jean, go ahead.
Well, yes, this is, being farming, this is the biggest problem we have today. And the reason is because we've had a free trading system that has actually destroyed agriculture, because, the family farmer in Australia was the institution for producing the food. And every family farmer had access to public credit to develop their farms. And we also only had to deal with the domestic market, not through, the deregulation and free trade where you see, the great examples when we were in the pig industry, right? We had the most amazing pig industry in Australia. And then all of a sudden they opened up to allow imports in. But it's never a fair trading system, because the people doing the importing deliberately dump a huge quantity of pig meat in 1 month to collapse the domestic price. So this is what we've been seeing for the last 4 decades. So what a farmer earns today compared to what a farmer earns in the 1960s is a fraction to what the huge investment and everything else. So back in the 1960s, where you had 400,000 family farmers, every farmer could afford to employ a family man. Right. So, for example, where I lived, our local school had 800 children. Now it has 180, because the farms are getting bigger. So how do farmers survive? Well, then they've got to get bigger and bigger, and they buy out all the neighbours. And then, of course, there is no future for the young people in rural Australia. Right. We used to have a system where, through healthcare and education, the government always used to include rural areas as part of their training. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. Most nurses and teachers are all on private contracts now. So what in essence, we've lost the whole idea of what it is to be a nation and the family unit, and this ability to actually, produce the world's food, because, the family farmer is a unique institution, because people farm because they love the lifestyle, but they're dedicated to what they're doing. So they're always, all the great new developments and inventions and ideas all come from that base. And it's never driven by making $1 million, because that's not how it is. But so what we've seen is the whole destruction of that way of life. And consequently now, so what farmers do to survive, they have to employ part-time workers. And and because we've got a lot bigger technology now, and huge ability to do things, you don't need as much in that way, because we have more mechanisation. But this idea of importing visa workers and that is just it's actually destroyed the future of our youth, of our country. Because if we actually had a government that was actually dedicated to having a proper rural industry and proper agriculture, and we'd have the proper scientific institutions, education, like we used to have fantastic ag schools and all those types of things, which actually allow for young people to stay in the towns. And also we have to have the industry back into towns, the manufacturing and everything else that we used to have. so that you can actually be viable to have the, the healthcare and the education. And we've got to get back to having, where every child has a right to universal education for free, right? Because as soon as you take away that ability, well, then you're going to have a class system. Most members of parliament, the older ones, they took for granted that they could go to university on the public money, whereas we've got to get back to having that system, because your economy depends on the ability of people to function, and through education and training, that's what you do. So, and that's the same there. There's no apprenticeships anymore. It costs a fortune to go to TAFE. The reality is to become highly qualified now is out of the reach of most families. Because we have this colossal housing bubble that's been imposed on the country. So all the money that people earn is just sucked into the huge big speculative bubble in some form or another. So that all has to change. Yeah.
And Chris, muted.
Still muted.
Unmute yourself there, Chris. There we go.
Awesome. Just want to reiterate everything that Jean has said, and just for our viewers, and Jean's in Western Australia, of course, and I'm over on the eastern states, and the experience is exactly the same. I've got 5 children, and my wife and I have dedicated our lives to trying to get them educated. But you know what that has meant is that they have not been able to stay in our community, because our education institutions are centralising. It's harder to get your kids educated. I grew up in the Riverina in southwest New South Wales, and I'm living in northwest Victoria. And a river divides our communities, and the problems are the same. And they're the same in Western Australia. And everything Jean has said, it is exactly what is happening. We have the gradual decay of society. We've got less and less young people in our communities. For some of the reasons that Jean pulled up was, our farms are getting larger. We've got corporatisation of farming enterprises now. We've got a lot of corporations doing a lot of activity on large amounts of land with very few people, and with our family farms that are just disappearing. Our family farming communities are disappearing, and it's very sad to see that. But we need to reverse that trend, because it's unsustainable. We all can't live in densely populated areas in our eastern cities and on the eastern seaboard, or we all can't live in high density population. We need to be out there getting young people into farming. We need to educate them. We need to get their creativity and unlock that. All these sorts of things that Jean has just highlighted. And I was just more or less wanting to reiterate that, and just say, give her, or give you, those who are on online, a lived experience that this is what is actually happening all over Australia, not just in where Jean is at the moment in Western Australia. So yeah, everything Jean has highlighted, I think, is absolutely imperative.
Thanks. And Jean, did you have something else you wanted to add to that? I see his hand is up still.
No, I couldn't get it down.
Oh, okay. I'll go to Jeff in a second, but I just want to make this comment because it pertains to this very subject matter, and it came in response to the governance question. Lucy said, this is from Lucy, she says, you can't legislate morality. In considering governance of any public institution, we have to properly educate and train the students and the younger generation who will be responsible for leadership in years to come. Does the Citizens Party have a perspective on this leadership dilemma? So I think we're already addressing that very question, but I wanted to highlight what Lucy said. Do we have a perspective on addressing the leadership dilemma in making sure there's a cultural aspect, the culture question of you can't legislate morality? So we'll go to Jeff and then to Craig.
100% behind Jean, what she said, for sure. And well, I just want to go back to this parity pricing again, because it's titled Keeping the Farmer on the Land Through Parity Pricing and Restoring the Nation's Sovereignty. Carl Wilkin, 1895 to 1968, is the man mostly credited with bringing what is known as the golden era of agriculture in the United States from 1941 to 1952. Wilkin was a farmer from Iowa who had studied economics at the University of Iowa. He found that agriculture was the biggest multiplier of money in the economy. For every $1 generated on farms, it ended up as $7 of new wealth in the national economy. In 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, the National Defense Act, the NDA, was passed within days. It was Wilkin who convinced Senator Harry Stegall that not only had they have to feed the nation, but the military as well, but more importantly, we have to produce the income to pay for this tremendous war effort, he said. Senator Stegall passed the Stegall Amendment Bill attached to the NDA that was simply stated that all farm commodities would be priced at 100% of parity. And because of that, they were able to stabilise agriculture, encourage food production, and pay for the war effort at the same time. During this time, 1941 to 1952, bank loan to deposits ratio fell to 16%. Farming was the biggest industry in the US. Farmers didn't have to borrow from one year to the next to plant crops or do anything else. It was all paid for by income of their farms. Farmers and rural people were depositing money in banks and taking interest from bankers. Everybody uses parity pricing in the economy: teachers, police, nurses, firemen, paramedics, ambulance, etc. It's called cost of living wage. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank
People-
Lucy for her question or follow up on the governance issue, because it's actually a very, very important issue. You can't legislate morality, because it actually gets to a very, very important point, which underlines why we talk about the general welfare and the common good of people. Because morality has to do with people and human beings, first and foremost. And we are fundamentally different as a species. Human beings are not animals. You know, we are endowed with creative reason, which makes us completely separate and different to animals. Yes, we've got animal-like qualities, but that human creativity, right, makes us divine. I'm not going to get religious on you. I'm just going to say that makes us, and it's a term that I used when I came back to Australia in 1992, from the LaRouche organisation, made the discovery that all human beings are created in God's image, where that image is creativity. Now ask yourself the question, how much is our education system today geared towards making young children creative? Bring them to the point where they make creative discoveries of how the universe works. Instead of just being filled with YouTube-based and Google search-based information, how much are they taught and step through pedagogically, taught like children, to make discoveries of principles? Ask yourself the question, do you know how Eratosthenes determined the circumference of the earth? Why not? It was one of the biggest discoveries in the history of mankind, and next to no one knows about it. Do you know how Kepler discovered the principle of universal gravity so that we could get rockets to the moon? No, it wasn't Newton. Forget that fraud. Why don't you know that? There are dozens upon dozens, hundreds, thousands of discoveries that aren't taught today, which show young children in particular how their mind works, how they can tap into this creativity. Have you ever wondered why Mozart was composing music at 3 years of age? And you see these savants around the place that can do incredible things at very, very young ages. That's the nature of human beings. Now, you can't have morality in people who don't understand that question. Our greatest leaders understood this question as their very being. So in terms of an education system, that's what we have to be teaching young people. And it's not getting religious, right? Our universe is governed by universal principles that are unseen. You can't see them with the senses, right? Gravity, you can't see gravity. You can only see the effect of gravity. You can't see the curvature of the earth, but through various things like Aristophanes did, you can see the paradoxes, the different shadows that come up in his discovery that make him think to the point that he can take in the entire universe into his mind, in this case, the planet Earth, and determine that the Earth was actually a sphere and it was a certain number of kilometers in circumference. He actually made that discovery in, I think it was about 350 BC, right? So there's a sense where if you want to be dumbed down as a human being, right, follow the neoliberal agenda, because neoliberalism didn't come from a philosophical background that wanted to lift human beings up. It came from the British East India Company, and it came from an oligarchical viewpoint. And oligarchical means rule by few. Don't get confused about the stuff about Russian oligarchs and stuff. That's a different use of the term. But oligarchy is the rule by few. It's monarchies, it's empires, and everything disgusting we see on the planet today comes from that viewpoint. The opposite viewpoint is this concept of the common good, the idea of the general welfare, which is actually embodied in the preamble of the US Constitution. It's whereby people are put first because of this creativity, this fundamental difference that we are from animals. So your question, Lucy, is a very profound one. That's our perspective on leadership. Start to teach young children how to make discoveries of the physical principles that govern the universe. We should have an entire, kindergarten to university curriculum of promoting the idea of making discoveries of principles we don't even know yet, right? It was Lord Kelvin, the guy that they named the Kelvin scale in temperature after, that said, oh no, you could never have such a thing as a flying machine. Man will never get off the ground, and then several years later, the Wright brothers flew their plane, right? But he was part of the establishment, part of the oligarchical faction, and you got to keep people down. You have to have a banking system that doesn't foster creativity in providing for the brilliant potentiality of the people in our country, our engineers and so forth, to produce. And we've had a lot of experience in the Citizens Party of talking to people that are put down all the time by the banking system instead of being able to flourish. And as Jean's illustrated, if you had that system in agriculture, supported family farmers because you want, and supported the communities around family farmers because of a banking system that promotes the family unit, and the incubation place of real human beings is the family unit. You destroy that, you destroy families, you destroy education. So very good question, but that's our perspective, Lucy, on this leadership dilemma. And it is a dilemma. And that's what the Citizens Party stands for, has been fighting for. I know Jan loves this sort of question, or this, what we've been doing in poetry and music and so forth. So maybe, Jan, you want to add to what I've got to say, but I mean, it's up to you.
Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot, but I think you were very eloquent and I don't need to say any more. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank all our candidates for their input tonight. I want to say also thank you to all the people who have sent in questions, and I apologise that we won't get to them all tonight. In fact, more are coming in, but what I would like to invite all the candidates to do now is, if you'd like to say any concluding remarks for this live event, I'll open the floor to you to do that in a second. But before I do so, for those online, we will do another event in a fortnight's time. That event on the 31st of March, 7:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time. The fight to clean out financial corruption in Australia. We'll have Denise Brayley, Robert Barwick, and several other candidates participating in that event like this one tonight. So tune in. That's 2 weeks from today. Put it in your diary, put it in your phone calendar, so you've got an alarm there. And go to YouTube and you can set up an alarm for that. I also invite everyone, keep an eye on our election page in the weeks, in the days to come. There will be more video content of candidates, why they're running, who they are, what passions they have, what drives them to do what they've done, and get involved in the Citizens Party fight. So I invite now the candidates for concluding remarks, and I have Jeff there with his hand up. So over to you, Jeff. Take it away.
Yeah, I'd just like to apologise for what I said to that person earlier, but when I read out that bank's poverty policies, it's the World Bank is part of the UN, the same UN which is pushing global warming and climate change and all the rest of it. So there's a serious, something seriously wrong with the UN when they've received more money than what they give out to the third world countries. It gets on my, gets right into my cruet, actually. I just want to say about this book too, and it's back to front.
It's good on
That's
this
right.
end. We can see it correctly.
Where are we? What
Yeah.
Australia must do to survive the depression, and it is coming. Believe me, it's coming. So that's part of the CEC's platform, this book as well. So I suggest anyone would like to get hold of it and have a good read. It's a good read. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for that. And your a plug for what Australia must do to survive depression. The depression prompted me to remember to also promote something in addition, and that is that we have candidate flyers for all of our Senate teams in every state and our fighting platform. Call the Citizens Party or email us to order bulk copies. You can distribute them locally in your towns, in your suburbs, postcodes. We need you to be our boots on the ground. You watching tonight, it's citizens taking responsibility. That's how it's going to happen. Call us, get in touch and talk to one of our organisers, and we can help and collaborate, put you in touch with other like-minded folks in your area. So I encourage everyone to get flyers as soon as possible. Would there be any other final concluding remarks from any candidates? Anne, go ahead.
I'll just add to what Craig was talking about in terms of the moral imperative or intention behind what our policies are. The idea of developing the creative potential within the population is a universal principle of how economy functions. That, you know, you can't develop the people if you don't have a productive physical economy that enables you to be able to do that too. So you've got to be, in the case of agriculture and farming, that's where your parity pricing comes in, that's where your regulation of industry, all of those things that ensure that your agricultural sector is as productive as it possibly can be. That's where public banking, so you have low interest, long-term credit available to those farmers. In the case of the situation where you've got the floods or drought, you know, we propose that there be debt moratorium. You know, farmers, the debt needs to be frozen at the time when they're going through that crisis, so they're able to get over the hump and be able to be producing again before they have to resume paying any form of debt. So everything is structured around making our economy as productive as possible, because out of a productive economy, the government raises the revenue that actually runs the hospitals and, you know, the health system and all of those things. And everything's geared towards the same outcome, that you want to lift the people to a position where they can be as productive as their potential allows them to be. Now, not everybody's going to be a scientist or an engineer or whatever, but people have to be able to have the opportunity to reach their potential, because that is what truly makes them human. We are made in the image of the Creator. We are co-creators in how we participate within the universe, and that's the principle that governs our policies.
Thank you, Anne.
Welcome, Anne.
I would like to thank everyone for joining us this evening for this live webcast tonight, Transforming Australia's Agriculture and Regional Communities. Stay tuned for more and have a good evening. Thank you.